Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will begin promptly at 6:30. If you would please find a seat. We'll be beginning in 5 minutes. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a moment. If you'd find a seat for us, that would be wonderful. Welcome. Come on in. Find a seat there. Very good. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Erosion 2020 as we talk about education, communication, and to advise, organized by our colleagues here at Coldwell Banker Woodland Schmidt. My name is Jason Rice, President of Michigan Operations for Schmidt Family of Companies, and it'll be a real pleasure and honor tonight to serve as your host as we enter through this forum for the next hour and a half or so. So erosion, Great Lakes water levels, and the effects of those effects on our communities are obviously a hot topic right now, and it's evident as the overwhelming response as we've prepared for tonight's event. And certainly as we welcome over 600 RSVPs to tonight's event, and also for the many that will be joining us via live stream online. Our goal tonight is to do exactly as the title indicates, to educate, to communicate, and to advise. And Coldwell Banker Schmidt Family of Companies serve dozens of Great Lakes communities from Marquette, Neskanaba, through the Mackinac Straits and Traverse City, Petoskey, and all the way through Pentwater, Saugatuck to our state line. And so lately, it's no surprise with all the media attention surrounding erosion that our real estate agents are frequently asked very important questions about the erosion issue by clients and many others. So it's clear to us as a real estate company focused on education and known for leading in the waterfront marketplace that we needed to be the conduit, a conduit to connect the people we serve with experts and professionals best equipped to answer these incredible questions. So here we are. We've assembled this evening a group of individuals ready to share their perspectives and expertise. And with that, we hope that you will depart tonight with more facts and understanding than you did when you arrived. However, we do know that as many of these hot topics, there will be different perspectives, and solutions and answers may not be readily at hand. But we also realize there are very many specific questions and unique situations, as was evident in the dozens of questions we received from our property owners up and down the lakeshore. So tonight's discussion will be broad. However, our panelists and their teams have agreed to remain in the lobby directly following the conclusion of the forum and have also provided contact information for further dialogue beyond tonight. And there's a rack card as you depart tonight with that information. Please be sure to get one of those. And with that, we're very grateful to have this wonderful group of panelists here tonight. So with that said, let's begin and get into the meat. But instead of me reading an introduction of each of our panelists, I've asked each to introduce themselves, and if they'd like to offer an opening remark. And so we'll start at the far end. Representative Slaw, we'll ask you to go first.
Thank you very much. So I'm Bradley Slaw. I live in the Zeeland area, and I represent the 90,000 people, roughly, that live in the Holland, Zeeland, and Hudsonville area. Had a chance to get engaged early on with the erosion piece, having a town hall, and have been able to continue to stay involved since then.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Corbin with the Allegan County Sheriff's Office. I've been in public safety for the past 26 years, and in the last 16 years with Allegan County Emergency Management Homeland Security Division. I am appointed by the board chairman, Commissioner Jim Story, and I report to the Allegan County Sheriff, Frank Baker.
Good evening. My name is Nick Bonstall, and I'm the Ottawa County Emergency Management Director here for Ottawa County. And we first started noticing the erosion issues here in the county back in June of 2019. And really started kind of ramping up in August and getting really involved with the issues that we have here within the county. This is a subject that's pretty near and dear to my heart and has taken a lot of our office's time to help coordinate. And anything that we can do to help, that's what we're here to do, and we're here to listen as well. So thank you for being here.
Good evening. I'm John Allis, and I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers out of Detroit. I wear a couple of different hats for tonight's purposes. One, I'm in charge of the group that produces the water level forecasts, that monitors water levels on the Great Lakes. So delivering a lot of bad news, unfortunately, to people recently with the elevated levels we've been dealing with. I'm also part of the International Lake Superior Board of Control. So that's a group that's part of the International Joint Commission. We handle administering the outflow regulation out of Lake Superior for the water that makes its way into Lakes Michigan and Huron. So hopefully today I can answer questions related to water levels and then the influence, or I guess lack thereof, that we have on the levels themselves. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Greg Wykamp. I'm with a firm called Edgewater Resources, and we're a coastal engineering and shoreline planning firm. We've been working on the shorelines of the Great Lakes for 40 years, and I'm here to help answer questions about what homeowners, municipalities, and businesses can do for strategies to respond to high water. And we typically act as kind of a bridge between the property owners, the permitting agencies, and the contractors, and just try to help that process go as smoothly as possible.
Good evening. John Meyer. I'm a real estate appraiser. I've been appraising real estate in central western Michigan for the last 44 years, specializing in upper end and waterfront properties. And I hope to learn as much as you guys from the panel tonight.
Good evening, I'm Jared Sanders. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. I'm the Assistant Director in our Water Resources Division. Before I pass the mic, I want to mention to all of you that we do have several of our local permitting staff here tonight. You may have seen them on your way into the building. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is, you know, at the 10,000 foot level, but if you have a specific project that you want questions on or want to know where your permit application is or something a little more site specific, please go out there and visit. We have folks, so Holland kind of splits our district. So we have folks in Grand Rapids that cover Ottawa County up to Oceana, and then our Kalamazoo office covers Allegan down to the state line. So.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jason Siffert. I'm an attorney with Kuiper Kramer out of Grand Rapids. I may not be talking as much as some of the other people on the panel here, but if you have specific legal questions about encroachments, easements, maybe some insurance-specific questions, if we don't get to that, I'd be happy to speak with you afterwards, and I can leave some cards, and I'd be happy to answer emails as well. So thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. So my name is Kevin Stryker. I work at Grand Valley State University. More specifically, I work at the Water Resource Institute up in Muskegon. I also live out near Montague, Michigan on a farm, work and live on that farm as well. I study climate change and global warming, and hopefully I'll be able to answer many of your questions.
Very good. In addition, we'd also like to acknowledge there's several folks in the audience, too, that are joining us tonight. And from the Michigan State Police Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division, Lieutenant Orville Thieker, Regional 6 Director. Dale George, there he is. Dale George, Public Information Officer. And Matt Schnepp, Manager for the Recovery Unit and the Hazard Mitigation Officer for the state. Thank you for being here. In addition, also from Congressman Bill Heisinger's office, Todd Whiteman, the District Director. Is Todd here? And Sarah Lisman, Program Coordinator. And I believe they'll be floating around throughout the evening also. There you go. Welcome. We'd also like to thank there are various other local community leaders that are joining us, Chamber of Commerce members and leaders, and also various association leaders that are also curious and want to get this information that are affecting their communities too. So we appreciate you as well being here tonight. And thank you again all for agreeing to be here and joining us. So let's get into the meat of tonight. As you'll see on the above here, the questions tonight are your questions. The questions were not derived by myself or others. We basically, over the last few weeks, have asked you to share questions of your concern, and we've gathered those questions and kind of organized them in a way that'll flow for this evening. That doesn't mean, though, that if a question you have in your mind pops up, to please text to that number. And my crew here behind, a lot of our colleagues from Coldwell Banker Schmidt, will help get those questions here, and we'll try to move those throughout the program as we move forward. So please don't hesitate to do so. But I think where we'll start off is where everybody's really wondering, and that's the water levels. And so the first question I have tonight, and I think we'll direct this down to you, John, to start things off, is how much have the Great Lakes actually risen?
Sure. So I guess very simple question, but a complicated answer coming. So all the Great Lakes right now are well above average. So it's not just Lake Michigan or Lake Huron issue. Each of the Great Lakes set a record high monthly mean level over the last 12 months. So this right now is a Great Lakes-wide issue that we're dealing with. Now, as far as how much they've risen officially, I guess it depends how you look at it. For those of you that might remember, back in 2013, Lakes Michigan and Huron had just set a record low water level back in 2013, actually. So just a quick 7 years later, water levels are actually up 5.5 feet from that lowest point, which is really the entire historical range of water levels we see on Michigan here, and we've kind of gone all the way from record lows to a record high level. Lake Superior followed kind of a similar pattern from near record lows to record highs now. You could also look at it as how much water levels have risen, I guess, year over year. So if you just looked at where Lakes Michigan and Huron were last year at the same time, we're roughly 1.5 feet higher than we were last year at this time.
Wow, very good. So the next obvious question, are there predictions? What's the prediction to see as we move forward in 2020 and beyond?
Yeah, and Jeanette, are you able to put the water level forecast image up on screens? And while she's doing that, if she can, great. I left a bunch of handouts of our most recent water level forecast at the core issues. So hopefully a lot of you were able to grab that on your way in. I can kind of walk you through that. That's perfect. Well, we'll get there. I think those are some other slides that, they're perfect. That's what I was looking for. So this shows the most recent 6-month forecast for Lakes Michigan and Huron. I'll try and orient you a little bit to the slide. It can be a little confusing if it's your first time looking at it. So what you see for a red line there is the recorded water level of Lakes Michigan and Huron over the last 2 years. So you can see from 2018 where levels were above average, 2019 to where they started flirting with record high levels. I'll orient a couple other features. You'll see a blue dashed line in the middle of that graphic. That's the long-term average water level. And you can see then the water level would typically follow a seasonal pattern, peaking in the summer, dropping over the winter, and rising each year. You can see then there are little black bars banded at the tops and bottom of the range with years on them. So those are the record high and record low monthly mean water levels with the years that those were set. So with that in mind, you can see you work your way across to where we are in January. We update this forecast at the beginning of every month. So this is the one that we issued just at the beginning of February. And what you see there is we did set a new record high January level on Lakes Michigan and Huron. And then looking forward, that green dashed line is our most probable forecast line with a shaded range around it. That shaded range addresses the fact that water level forecasts, especially as you get 6 months out, are very uncertain. As you can imagine, just trying to find a weather forecast accurate a few days out is very uncertain. So that uncertainty band is a band that would cover where we would expect water levels to be 90% of the time. And obviously, if we continue to see very wet conditions, we'd expect the level to track along the top of that shaded band. If we see very dry conditions, we'd expect the levels to be at the bottom of the band. So if you're going to look at what the forecasted level is currently out as kind of a peak in the June-July timeframe, that's roughly 7 inches higher than where we are right now. And that's roughly 4 inches or so higher than the peak that we had on Michigan and Huron last year in July. So.
Very good. Dr. Stryker, we're probably moving in this direction. So the next question is a climate change question. And will climate change continue to impact these high lake levels in the future? Is it likely that lake levels will keep getting worse and never retreat because of higher temperatures? Can you speak to that?
So in speaking to that, can I also bring up some slides?
Absolutely.
I have to stand up. I don't like sitting down. I have an old idea that, oh, that's okay. I got one here too, but thanks. I figure that if I sit down, the blood flows down, and I can't think because all the blood should be up here. Is it okay for me to start? So I put together a little bit of a slide presentation when I was first asked to come here. Real quickly and brief, obviously living on the edge is not funny if you're actually living in that house. We've seen a lot of this stuff before, right? Back in the 80s. Somebody, in fact, earlier today said, hey, I've got some information, you should see some of this. But we've seen similar high-level tides or levels where houses are caving in catastrophically. Oh, does that work? What John was talking about earlier is very true. This is not just a Lake Michigan effect. We've seen this, and we are seeing this with all other Great Lakes. And the information that you see, for example, from John, where he works, you see levels going back from 1918 all the way to 2010. Predictive, trying to be predictive, but we see roughly, if we focus simply on Lake Michigan and Huron, we see roughly, 25 to 35 year cycles. We see high tides and low tides, or high levels and low levels. So we expect to see much more of this. Again, this is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They go back around roughly 1918. There's another website, a little hard to see in the bottom. It's called Climate Workspace. They take it back to 1860. Interesting is that they've seen levels as high as 582 feet back then. So when we talk about high or low levels, we're expecting to see high levels again. How high? Maybe as high as that, I don't know. John will be a good person to talk about that. When we talk about climate change, I study climate change. I've been doing that for about 25, 30 years, and global warming. We study that from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up here to Lake Michigan. We anticipate, we say that annually, globally, temperatures have gone up by 1 degree centigrade, roughly 1.8 degree Fahrenheit. On average, not a big deal for you and me, big deal if we look at stuff like pathogens or animals. We also say 16 of the 17 warmest years in the measurement record occurred from 2001 to 2017. And global average, we're expecting that to increase to roughly 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So what does that mean for a lot of us for climate change? We say that the frequency and the intensity is changing. If you talk to a lot of the homeowners, you talk to the farmers, something's going on. Even if you don't buy climate change, and I hear people say all the time, climate change is a witch hunt. The fact is that there's something's going on, something's changing, something's happening to the environment. Oops. In the future, as a climate scientist, I'm expecting to see more climate change variables. I expect to see more of this weird weather pattern. I expect to see a lot more moisture. If you want, I can stop there. I know
Okay.
John was talking about some of the predictions, and when we get there, we can address
Very good.
more of that.
Okay. So along those lines, and I think you had a slide up a moment ago, and this is the next question that was submitted. There's the idea out there, I'm not sure if it's an accurate one, and maybe you can help us, that water levels on Lake Superior have been declining over the past few months, but water levels on Michigan and Huron have been increasing, despite the modest amounts of precipitation we received and warmer than usual temperatures. Can you explain the discrepancy? Is that John?
Yeah, a couple different things with that question. So one is just that the Great Lakes basins, well, I guess each lake's specific basin are so large that we typically do see weather patterns that will be very different over one lake basin than another. So it's not uncommon to see a very wet month over Lake Michigan, yet a pretty dry month in general over Lake Superior. When I look back over the last 3 months for Superior and Michigan Huron, it has been wetter over the Michigan Huron basin than it has been over Superior. So it's not surprising that we are seeing a steeper drop in levels on Superior over that time. Michigan Huron's been pretty steady, a little bit of a rise. So that's really what's going on there. But the other piece that I would address there is the comment that there might be modest amounts of precip over Michigan Huron. There may be some specific locations that have had modest precip, but the kind of state as a whole, if you look back over these last handful of months, last 12 months, last 60 months, I think the last 12 months have been the wettest 12 months on record for the state of Michigan. The last 60 months have been the wettest 60 months on record for Michigan. So the basin as a whole is just very wet right now. So even though the precip total itself may not be huge, when we're looking at total supply of water to any of the lakes, one of the terms that is important to understand is something we call net basin supply, which is just a fancy way to say take the amount of precipitation that falls on the lake take the amount of water that's running into the lake from the surrounding watershed, so all the rivers and tributaries are flowing into it. And then there's also a lot of water that's evaporating off the lake surface. So when you add those things together, that's really what the kind of total supply of water is into a lake, basically from Mother Nature. Right now with the basin just being so wet, we're seeing a lot of runoff, even under modest precip totals. And actually the warm temperatures we've been seeing this winter act as a way to keep more water into the lakes, because we haven't been seeing as large evaporation off the lake surface as we normally would over a winter. So that's also been so instead of the warmer temperatures being a way to dry up the basin, it's actually been a way that it's keeping the basin more wet by reducing evaporation. So again, that's kind of the explanation for why things have been wet, and then also why we can see differences in one lake basin to the other.
So I just want to piggyback on what John was talking about there. So the wettest 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year period in 120 years of weather records in this state. And so what is happening is ultimately is not just is that going right directly into the Great Lakes, but that has saturated our soils. That's brought our inland groundwater tables up. And you're going to start hearing a lot more news about like inland lakes that are flooding, particularly kettle lakes that don't have an outlet, because in some areas the groundwater table has risen several feet. And so the sponge is full. There's no water that would have typically been retained inland is now moving out faster. And in fact, that's leading to high flows in our river. So if you look at river hydrographs all across the state, for example, the Grand River at Grand Rapids since October 1st has already passed more than what would typically come in a full year. So in 4 months, there's been 12 months worth of flow that's already passed through the Grand River and Grand Rapids, and of course, you guys know where that comes out. So this issue, this huge rainfall issue, certainly the shoreline erosion is getting a ton of attention because, well, rightfully so, because it's been catastrophic. But this is a problem that's touching every corner of the state right now.
Thank you. So next question is looking ahead, if you would, and if we had historical average temperatures and precipitations. So the question is, how long would it take for water levels on Lake Michigan or Lake Huron to decrease by 12 inches? What does that look like?
That's actually a really good question. It would take a little bit of time and modeling for me to put together a good answer for that. I guess to put that in perspective, I would just kind of maybe point back to our forecast that certainly if you look 6 months out and even under very dry conditions, you can see that it doesn't get us that far below record high water levels. So it kind of could put in your mind that if we saw average conditions over the next year, you're really not going to be dropping the water level a whole lot kind of year over year by just seeing average conditions. It'll really take dry conditions to drive that kind of a drop. I don't know if anyone else wants to offer more detail, but.
Well, and oppositely too, if the levels rise another 8 to 12 inches, are there certain communities, certain areas that you're focused on, that commercial ventures that might be shut down, things that will be affected if we get in that 8 to 12 range beyond? Is that Nick? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take that from a local perspective here in Ottawa County. We have done, and actually tomorrow, we've been doing a lot of tabletops with our local jurisdictions and using some GIS map data of basically what it looks like with another 8 to 12 inches and where those impacts might be on our critical infrastructure here within the county. I can tell you just the normal, for people who have been around Ottawa County for a long time, it's those normal low-lying areas like Spring Lake Township, Spring Lake Village, City of Grand Haven, your inland lakes like Lake Macatawa. You guys are already seeing that full to the top, so another 8 inches is obviously going to create some issues. And then we've actually been seeing something that's relatively different with the Grand River is we usually hit our, basically it's called our action level, our low indicator on the river, once in the spring, once in the fall. But because the lake's full, we've kind of been bumping up against that indicator all year. We've actually hit it 11 times this year. So it's really creating just everything's full. You know, the soil's full, the rivers are full, the lake's full. So any additional rise in that is going to cause some issues. Hopefully, we'll obviously work through the panel here, but hopefully it's not going to be a 12-inch impact. That's what we're hoping for. We're hoping it's obviously a lot lower than that, and it won't be as effective, but we'll see what happens in the future.
Anyone else? We'll move on. This is a big question, and as we move on, and I think everyone's asking that, at the end of the day, is there really a solution to stopping the water level from rising or to stop erosion? I know we're going to get into some mitigation and some of the reasons in a few minutes, but at the end of the day, is there a solution? Is there a way to stop this? John?
Yeah, I can talk from a water level rising point of view. And again, with some of these next questions, I'll explain a little bit more what kind of ways the water levels can be influenced. But you know, when it really comes down to it, there's really not enough control or locations that we have control over inflows or outflows to make any real difference on the water levels. So especially on Lakes Michigan and Huron, we're really at the mercy of just Mother Nature and how wet things are. So I'll explain a little bit more to put that in perspective, kind of the ranges that we can, you know, have some influence on the level. But long story short, there's no regulation plan, there's no kind of additional way to divert water out of the system that we could, you know, really control the water level rise in any meaningful way.
Thank you. Jerry, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so ultimately, I mean, erosion is and has been since the glaciers receded. It's been a natural process that's been occurring along our shorelines the entire time. If you look the shorelines, even if you look at the lines back in the 30s, the shorelines are substantially receded since that time. It's obvious, and we've hit these high water periods before, and it obviously accelerates that process. That is where the sand that you're seeing in the nearshore areas came from. It came from that natural erosive process. I think the long-term average around Michigan is somewhere around a foot a year, speeding up and slowing down. And so erosion is going to continue to occur, but obviously now we have homes, we have cities, we have businesses in the way, and so how we deal with that is really the challenge. I want to plug something really quickly. Someone can explain this a heck of a lot better than I just did. So Dr. Guy Meadows from Michigan Tech did testimony in House Natural Resources this past Tuesday. So if anyone is interested, I think those are posted online. He's a coastal engineer, and he explains this process, sort of what's happening right now, what's been happening long term, does a wonderful job of that. So I want to plug that while I have the opportunity. So
Very good. Greg, did you want to go ahead?
I'd like to add one thing. I think the reason, or one of the reasons we're seeing such severe erosion right now as compared to years past is, yeah, it's the high water, and that matters a lot. But we have almost no ice cover. And if you've grown up in the West Michigan, as I have and most of us have, we're used to seeing, you know, several hundred yards of ice offshore, sometimes ice all the way across the lake. When you have a half mile of ice or a quarter mile of ice or even 100 yards of ice along your shoreline, that serves as an incredible wave attenuator, and that keeps all of that wave energy off of your shoreline. So even with the high waters, if we had anything approximating normal ice cover, we wouldn't have anything like the erosion that we're seeing in these storms right now. So as we dive in later about, you know, what can stop it, it's essentially providing some type of armoring solution. But one other thing on the other businesses that would be affected, and particularly safety issues, is a lot of marinas are really in trouble, because if you have a fixed dock, the fixed docks are going to be submerged, or if they're not submerged, all the electrical infrastructure is in that structure and is submerged. And so I'll just encourage you on behalf of all the marina owners, if you have your boat in a marina and they turn the power off this summer, don't complain. They're trying to keep you safe. So we'll get into that later.
Very good points. No, thank you. Next question is a bit of a legalistic question. Jason, I know you and I spoke a few moments ago about this one, but the Michigan Supreme Court in Glass versus Gokul held that the public can walk anywhere on private beach between the water and the ordinary high water mark, setting aside long-held shoreline walking only. In light of this new and likely to grow high water mark, is the Michigan legislature considering legislation to better define this topic. And we had this riparian right conversation. Maybe you speak to that for us.
And I think Jared might be able to, supplement this a little bit because he is going to know more than I will about, for regulatory purposes, how they actually get those high water marks set. But if you have the high water mark regulated, and now you have this water coming way up into your land and it's eroding, you don't lose ownership to that land underneath the water that's now up there. It's not like the state having title to the submerged land, so you're not going to lose ownership to that submerged land. That said, you are going to be subservient to those public use rights, like in the glass case. So if you have this water line, although it might not be defined as the new high water mark, where it physically is present, you're going to be subservient to that public use. So, you know, if somebody's jumping off a boat out there or getting down to the water level lawfully, they will be able to walk on that submerged water. But like I said, you don't lose title to it. So when it does recede back down, that will still be your land.
Good. Perfect. So I think John mentioned a moment ago, we're going to talk about the flow because there's a lot of questions focused around the inflow and the outflow of water in the Great Lakes. So the first question is, please discuss water flow in the Great Lakes. What are the primary inflow and outflow direction, and at what points can we or have we been controlling?
Sure, and getting a little bit of help to get a map up behind me. Make this description way more meaningful for you. Perfect. Okay, so I'll kind of work through how, the first part, how water flows through the system. So if you start in the very northern part of the map, the northern edge of Lake Superior, there are two diversions that actually divert water into Superior from Canada that would otherwise flow through the Albany River Basin north into Hudson Bay. And I'll discuss those diversions here in a little more detail. But from there, kind of the primary inflow to Lake Superior is just what comes in through net basin supply. What the precip that falls on the lake, the runoff from the watershed. That's really the primary inflow of water into Lake Superior. The outlet of Lake Superior is on that far eastern side of the lake, down the St. Mary's River, and right there we have marked, this is the Lake Superior Control Works. So that's one of 2 points on the system where we actually do have the ability to control the amount of water that leaves the lake. So through the Sioux Locks, through a couple of hydropower plants, a series of gates across the river there, the Lake Superior Board of Control has the ability to control the amount of water that leaves the Lake Superior down through the St. Mary's River. From there, water flows into Lake Huron, and then, and I keep referring Lakes Michigan and Huron together as one body of water, and that's because of the connection through the Straits of Mackinac. It's large enough that the two lakes really do kind of rise and fall as one body of water. There is one primary outlet from Lakes Michigan and Huron, and that's down through the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and then Detroit River system. And there are no control structures, no other mechanisms there to control the amount of water that leaves Lake Huron. That just will leave the lake naturally. There's also the Lake Michigan diversion at Chicago. So that's where water is actually diverted out of the basin for shipping and sanitary reasons in Chicago. Again, a very tiny amount of water, kind of like the amount of water that's diverted in from Long Lake and Agoki. I can talk about that in a little more detail here soon too. So again, following the path of water, if you work your way from Lake Huron into Lake Erie, then the outlet for Lake Erie is the Niagara River, again on the far eastern edge of the lake. That's where water will flow naturally over the falls. There are also two hydropower entities, very large operations there at Niagara Falls, one on the Canadian side, one on the US side. And we actually cannot control the amount of water that leaves Lake Erie. There is another international control board that manages how much water goes over the falls versus how much goes through the hydropower plants. But there's no way to control that total flow. So if the hydropower entities aren't taking as much water, that means that water is just going over the falls. If they're taking more water, it means less water is going over the falls, but the same total amount of water is always leaving. If you then work your way into Lake Ontario, that's, you're kind of at the end of the system there, and its outlet at the far eastern edge, again, along the St. Lawrence River, is the other point where we do have control over the amount of flow that leaves the lake. So again, there's another international control board that deals with Lake Ontario and then the St. Lawrence River, and again, that amount of water can be controlled. To point out more specifically here to Lake Michigan and Huron, really the only controllable location here that will impact Lake Michigan is the amount of water that leaves Lake Superior. It's a very small, a relatively small amount of water that we can actually control there in relation to, again, the amount of water that comes in through natural supplies. So the current regulation plan, it actually tries to balance the amount of water between the two lakes. So if we find that things have been really dry on Lake Superior and we're dealing with record highs on Michigan Huron, we're going to be scaling back, flow to keep that on Superior. The issue we've been dealing with recently is both lakes have been sitting at record high levels, so it makes it tough to, do any kind of meaningful balance when both lakes are sitting there at record highs. Maybe I'll let you ask a couple questions.
Yeah, I was
and
going
then
to say,
I'll
John,
get
with
into
that
the
in
next
mind,
details.
the next question was kind of, you talked about the inflow from Lake Superior. Is there a way to increase the outflow at Niagara if that's one of those locations where there is infrastructure that can help with that? Is it possible to increase?
Right, so there's no way for us to increase the amount of flow that leaves Lake Huron or leaves Lake Erie. So those are just, again, natural. We don't have the ability to control those outflows and increase those in any way. Yeah, I think that answers that question pretty well.
Okay. The next question will go down to Representative Slaw at the end. This was an interesting question. There's obviously some challenges with other areas of our country that has need of fresh water. And the question was, why don't we temporarily sell Lake Michigan fresh water to California to pay for all the high water damage? So I know it's a real question. So any thoughts on that?
If I make some conjectures about that, it could go viral, and we could be in trouble. There really is no way to take out the amount of water that we would need to be able to have any kind of significant bearing on the lakes themselves, nor is there a way to be able to transport that water to be able to move it in a place where people would want it. So the answer is no, there is no good way to make that happen. I think John has some ideas that he's looking to actually put in a graphic at some point in time. It's not there yet, but he's looking to do that for how little, even if you used all the water for the whole city of Chicago, how small, infinitesimally small that amount is on the scale of what we have in the Great Lakes. And so I think the answer is really no, there's not a good way to do that. And we're really not ready to build a tunnel from here to California to move that water from here to there, I'm sure.
Fair enough. John, did you want to chime in? Or?
No, we were talking a little bit about this question earlier. And I guess just besides the capacity issue, there are a lot of legal hurdles, with the Great Lakes Compact and, with, this being such a precious resource, there are a lot of safeguards in place so that water can't be taken out of the Great Lakes Basin that would need to be overcome as well. So again, lots of kind of physical and legal hurdles to how that would work.
Fair enough. Next question. How is the increased water levels calculated to predict an impact on shoreline erosion, if at all? I'm not sure if that might be a Jared question, or is there a relationship between the water levels and the quantity of erosion that we're seeing?
Oh, yeah, I certainly think that that's true. So there's a few different things that happen when the water levels come up, and if you're here, you have probably had some experience with that. So one of them is at some point, as the water levels have come up, the beaches, the foredunes, the things that typically break up wave energy before it hits the bluff that your home is on, those things get chewed up by wave action. The other thing that happens is near shore, shallow sand or substrate. Around here it's sand, but in other areas it's rock. is probably the very best erosion protection that we have. That's what breaks up the wave energy. That's why the waves, even when we have 12-foot waves out in the lake, there aren't 12-foot waves hitting your lakeshore. That's because the waves themselves are dragging on the bottom. So as the water levels come up, higher, stronger and stronger wave energies begin to hit that bluff, and then as it gets high enough and it's hitting that sort of back dune or the primary dune, where a lot of homes are at. So it's stronger wave energies hitting a steeper, unconsolidated slope. So there's little doubt that there's a pretty strong connection there.
Good. Scott C. at the end there, I think we'll go to you. The next question was, are you watching, monitoring, how many homes are predicted to be affected? Is there a quantity that you're watching right now or that you anticipate will be in some challenges in the year ahead?
Yeah, sure. We had some difficulties at first starting up and identifying, or how to identify these homes. You know, what were we going to use as a methodology for determining these homes as being dangerous? So we worked together with our colleagues up and down the shoreline and developed a methodology to determine which ones were at most danger and which ones weren't. And we built an endangered structures platform that we're able to calculate and put information into that database, and that's shared with the state of Michigan in order for us to kind of monitor as these homes progressively get worse, you know, they become more dangerous, then we can start modeling that and understand what we need to do in order to protect those structures.
Good. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just really want to quick jump in on that. So there's a really good example of collaboration that's associated with that. So it's a Michigan State Police database that's storing all of that information. Obviously in coordination, the emergency managers are doing a lot of legwork to populate that. And then just recently, we were able to make a connection between the MSP database and our permitting database so that we can see the structures that are in that database that are threatened, and also the emergency managers and MSP can see the ones where there are permits already issued in terms of shoreline erosion control. So I just think that was a really good example of collaboration and the folks trying to work together to solve a problem. So.
Very good. Go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things that we really had to determine was what was the criteria we were going to use for the assessment, because there is no national model, right? So what we used was these categories. We used structures that were greater than 50 feet from the bluff's edge, 25 to 50 feet, 10 to 25 feet, and then within 10 feet is our red. That's our, our high number for sure. So overall here in Ottawa County, we have 84 total structures that we've assessed from all the way from Holland all the way up to Spring Lake, obviously. Of those, we have 6 that have been successfully moved, 3 that have been demolished, 1 very close to going in but was demolished prior to it going in. We have 4 that are within 10 feet, and then 36 that are 10 to 25 feet, just to give you an idea of the numbers that we're working with in Ottawa County.
Wow. Thank you. So next question is, as we move towards that mitigation, so how can we determine if our existing bluff protection is sufficient to manage the rising water levels? And are there signs we should be looking for to anticipate erosion problems in the future? Does anybody want to? Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, so one of the things that you can look for is a question we get asked all the time is, well, is there a guarantee that my shoreline protection is what do you guarantee? And I always say, I guarantee it's going to fail someday. I just don't know how soon, and that's a question because of how high water, how big the waves and ice and everything else. So it's a little bit of a glib answer, but the fact is when you build an armor stone revetment, you have to maintain it. And so what you should be looking for is settlement in your protection. You should be looking for movement and those types of things where if you had a rock revetment, if it's starting to settle, it had nice straight lines. Those are the obvious things, settlement and movement and drainage like that. I would also recommend you look north and look south at your neighbors. If your neighbor to the north is starting to fail, your system can be flanked, and so you can start to have damage coming in from the side, which is some other issues. So it's really pretty common sense stuff. Just look around for that kind of settlement like you would see.
Very good. Next question regards to other contributors. So are there other factors beyond the rising water levels contributing to erosion? Example, springs and bluffs, and are there a way to control some of those contributors?
I'll take that one too.
Sure.
So one of the things, again, as it was said earlier, that we have very high water tables right now. So one of the things that you see on the taller bluffs is they're not always consolidated. You may have a layer of clay with a layer of sand and a layer of clay, and then you'll have perched water tables. And so if you have sand, if you have water table that's up high perched, it can move through and it can actually destabilize that bluff. So certainly that's an issue. There are certainly strategies to take that water out and move it around. Highly recommend you engage an engineer to take a good look at that, or actually more, in that case, it's really a geotechnical engineer who can look at that and help you come up with a solution. The one thing I would promise you as somebody who does this for a living, and we were working with hundreds of clients, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. You really need to have your site looked at and get the right professionals to help you find an answer. There's a lot of different contractors with a lot of different solutions. You want to make sure you're getting the right solution for your site.
Go ahead, Nick. Scott.
Yeah, and we've been speaking with a lot of geologists, myself and our colleagues, and we've learned and determined that there are other factors, like we talked about, human factors that are causing some of the difficulties that we see. But we would look at, like Dr. Chase has a really good study that he's done since 1994 along the lake shore of here in Michigan. The last few years, he's determined that those things are problematic, the things that we're contributing to cause or increase that shoreline erosion. So I would encourage people to look at these studies and really find out what is being in these studies that be helpful in reducing that risk.
Very good. Next question, very generic, but in terms of mitigation, is it better to act now or to wait until erosion, the high water levels have peaked and we're on the best? So we act now, or do we need to act now and avoid future problems, or is that making the problem worse? Go ahead, Greg.
Not to sound glib, the best time to act was 5 years ago. We've had a lot of clients that we've worked with that we came up with strategies for. We have clients, there's sort of two clients. We have a client that says, I used to have 500 yards between my house and the water, and now I have 490, and I'm nervous. And we say, you're okay. And then we have other clients who call us and say, there's water hitting my foundation, and there's a storm coming next Tuesday. I need rock. That's also not a good time. I would recommend you move now. The challenge with now, of course, is that all the contractors are very, very busy. A strategy that would have cost, pick a number, $100,000 5 years ago is probably $150,000 to $200,000 now, if you can get the contractor out on site. So I would encourage you to, again, if you have it inspected and you've got some time, I would encourage you to wait, simply because the cost is going to be higher right now than it would be later. If you're in a situation where your home's immediately at risk, you just have to move. And I mean move with a protection, not move your house.
And I was actually, that's the exact lane I was going to go down. Is, there is, I guess, really two different things that kind of we've seen happen. One of them is, you have time on your side and you go through the process, and the process does take some time. So making sure you're planning enough, ahead of time to go through that process and get your contractor lined up, get on the contractor's list, because like you said, contractors are fully booked right now, and you're even seeing some shortages in supply with certain items. But then you have the other lane, which is that emergency side of maybe some people who, this is a secondary home, they haven't been here all year, and they come to find their property in a certain area. That's really what we've been trying to get the word out on, and working with the local jurisdictions to even mail information, letters to people saying, hey, make sure you're inspecting your property and knowing where that erosion, knowing where your bluff is at this point. So we'll continue to assess throughout the course of the year and provide that information to the locals, but time is a very big factor with this for sure.
I'm going to quick jump in on
go
that.
right ahead,
And just to, when the question was asked, those of us who deal with this every day all looked at each other and smiled, because we're all going to give the same answer. It's time to act. So, and then one thing that I did want to mention, because Nick was getting into both of them were getting into the planning stuff, but and this could have popped up at any time here, but it's a really good strategy to work with your neighbors on this stuff as well. So if you've got 100 feet of frontage and your home is at risk, just armoring your frontage doesn't take you out of the risk zone. And so the sooner you can get ahead of it and the better you can get along with your neighbors and come up with a coordinated strategy. You may even have some economies of scale in terms of cost savings along with that. So, but that does, as they mentioned, it takes time to get a contractor. It's going to take time to get it, a design done on that. So act and get ready now. That's
Good. Well, we're going to get into some of the meat now when it comes to structures and things like that. I just received a text question. Thank you, Nikki. The question is not on your list, guys, but it says, does the list of an at-risk structure include homes on lakes that are connected to Lake Michigan, i.e. Lake Macatawa, White Lake, etc.? Are those homes at risk too, and are we monitoring those as well?
So currently, and this may help a little bit to understand the process we go through to do this as well, but currently this is looked at as a Lake Michigan damage assessment strategy. So I'm not saying that the inland lakes or river system may not be out of the question in the future, especially as we get into maybe higher considerations for inland flooding, depending on our spring system that comes through. But we actually do this with our partners at the Michigan State Police. We actually fly a helicopter that has GIS coordination software on it, and we can actually take the picture of the parcel and then link all the parcels together. That has traditionally been a lakeshore only flight, but like I said, with spring flooding and other things that might take effect, it's not out of the question, but as of right now, the only data that we keep is definitely the structures that are specifically on the lakeshore shoreline.
And another kind of along those same lines, you mentioned a moment ago that some of those databases are being maintained. The question is, are those databases public? Are they accessible to the average folks online?
Thank you so much for that question, because with everything that we do, the biggest thing that we want to do is help the homeowners who are out there. And one of the ways that we can do that is by making these pictures of your properties public. So all you have to do is call your emergency management agency, I know Ottawa County here, give us your address, we'll ask you a few questions, and we'll send those files directly to you. Like I said, that's a partnership through the Michigan State Police Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division and us. The nice thing is we've conducted flights August 1st, October 25th, and December 20th. So if you want your property data, you can actually see the erosion that's occurred from August 1st till now based on the assessments that we've been doing.
I think additionally, we have a drone team at the Allegan County Sheriff's Office. So if you find your home at risk or you're afraid that your home is at risk, we'll do a drone flight and provide that data as well to you, that video coverage.
Very good. Good. We're going to skip a couple here, guys, and get down to number 26 as we talk about, what can be done to rebuild a severely eroded bank? And we're going to get into some of these details of structures. I think, Greg, this will be, go ahead.
Okay, well, there's a lot to be answered there. It's going to depend a lot on the slope. So if it's a tall bluff and you've lost the toe, it's very difficult to restore that. If it's a lower bluff, it's really more of a question of patience, and the standard littoral drift will, when the waters recede, with luck, it will start to reform naturally. The whole bluff ecosystem is not one that really lends itself well to artificial creation. It's one that you want to work with nature on that.
Okay. So as we continue, it says, please, number 27, please discuss environmental and structural pros and cons to hardening the shoreline with those artificial structures such as revetments, etc. And what are the pros and cons? How might these structures affect the shoreline reforming, littoral flow of sand, etc.?
Sure. Quick point, littoral drift, for those of you who don't know what that is the movement of sand that naturally occurs from, generally in our area, it's north to south, and so there's kind of the sand that's in front of your home is actually kind of a moving train of sand. You can visualize it as sand that's moving north to south, and if you ever look at the north side of a pier structure, you always notice that the beach on the north side is bigger than the beach on the south side, and that's because that pier interrupts that drift. So everything that we do to the shoreline has an impact to that drift. They're really the toolbox for shoreline armoring. And when I'm talking about armoring, I'm talking about permanent strategies. There's a lot of temporary strategies, dams and sandbags and other things. The more permanent strategies for hardening the shoreline is really steel sheet pile, which is that vertical steel that you see out there, and rock armor stone revetment. The steel sheet pile has some very serious negative effects. It harms the environment in terms of habitat. The worst thing that it does is every ounce of energy that hits that vertical steel wall bounces right back out and puts that energy right back in the lake. Almost none of it is dissipated, and so you end up with bigger waves immediately in front of your wall. So you don't want that. It's also very expensive. The rock armoring is certainly a better strategy for armor stone. What that will do is it absorbs some of the energy. It's not really absorbing it, it's diffusing some of that energy, and that allows you to protect your shoreline without putting a lot of that wave energy back out into the water. Now, even that is still going to have an impact because, again, as Jared mentioned, if you armor your shoreline in front of your home and your neighbors don't armor theirs, there's a tendency for that to start to disturb that flow, and it can create some unintended consequences. All of those things are considered in the permit process. But you absolutely want to, if you can, as Jared said, you want to work with your neighbors and have a continuous front, and you have a much better strategy there.
Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, so I want to jump in on that. So Greg was talking about seawalls and riprap. So for the most part, this would hold true for us and for the Army Corps that needs to issue permits for this. Even if you were going to do a steel seawall, we're typically going to require rock to be placed in front of that for the exact reasons that Greg just mentioned. And then from just a larger perspective, Greg mentioned the train of sand that's moving north to south. Here, we know that armoring the shoreline and riprap or rock lessens this effect, but armoring the shoreline actually, no matter how you do it, is going to increase scour. And I mentioned the long-term process of erosion adds sand, but we also lose sand out to the deep water that's not recoverable when water levels go back down. And so we know when we armor the shoreline, we're actually accelerating that process of sand being lost out into the deep water. And at the same time, we're stopping the adding of new sand. I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that we don't build these structures to protect people's homes, but as Greg mentioned, everything that we do has some level of consequence, and that's what we're trying to balance as we make these decisions.
Good. Lots of answers included in that answer for question number 28. We move on to what regulations will there be for homeowners regarding seawalls? So we've just talked a little bit about that. How will seawalls affect public access to Lake Michigan and beach access? And then I think the big question I think we touched on a moment ago, what's the timeline for these permits? And if protection is installed without a permit, what are the consequences of that decision? So a lot baked into that question.
Would have been nice to break that up a little
I
bit,
know,
Chris.
sorry.
So certainly structures, any structure that touches the water, it requires a permit from both Eagle and from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In fact, the Corps Regulatory actually steps outside of the water. We don't necessarily. And so it certainly requires a permit from us. I'm not sure what order we're going in here, so I'm probably going to be talking for a few minutes here. So this is an opportunity to talk about permitting. One of the things that, frankly, we're struggling with is there is a lot of misinformation out there about the permitting process and what's happening. So I want to just divert from the questions a little bit and spend a little bit of time on that. So in October, when the storms hit and really everything really broke loose, I know many of you have been struggling longer than that, but it became apparent to us that we were going to have to act to do something. And so the decision we made in October was that the department was not going to be, or the permitting process for the department was not going to be the reason that someone lost their home. So we convened an internal response team focusing in 3 areas. That is expediting permits, customer service tools, and then communications. So on the expediting permitting front, we diverted extra resources out to the lakeshore to be able to issue issue permits, freed up overtime. Those folks that I mentioned at the start, our district staff, have frankly been unbelievable. They've been coming in weekends, holidays, working overtime, and moving those permits out. And so the typical processing time for our permits historically is about, for this type of permit, is about 60 days. In the first quarter of this year, the average was 15 days, but we're also prioritizing them as they come in. And so the highest risk, we're prioritizing based on risk to homes, critical infrastructure, human health, and safety. So the more dire your situation is, that is going to move that up to the front of the pile. And actually, there's a long list of examples where we're issuing the permit on something that was pretty serious within 24 hours or even the same day that the application came in. And that is due to the hard work of the folks that are, I don't know if they're standing back there, I don't have my glasses on, but they might be out there. And we've also opened up some tools as well. So again, sticking with that theme of the fact that, you know, the department is not going to be the reason that someone loses their home. And it runs the scale from, in certain circumstances, and we've started doing this more recently, we'll use what we call discretion, which is the home is at immediate risk. Something needs to happen today. And for folks that are engaging with us, contractor, homeowner calls us, we'll essentially say, yep, go ahead, do it, get me a permit app next week or sometime after that. About a month ago, we also opened up conditional permitting. One of the things we didn't realize originally was that there were going to be challenges, not just in getting a contractor, but also on the technical services front in terms of getting surveys and engineering sign-off for some of these projects, particularly in critical dune areas. And so we've opened up what we call conditional permitting, which is you're not able to get everything, but you can get us enough to make a good decision, a good permittable decision, and then turn some of that information in later. And then there's more of just an expedited process where it's just, we're going to do the full process, but we're going to move through it quickly. And then there probably isn't anyone in this room who's experiencing this, but for folks where there's not really an immediate risk, we'll go through the whole process and do public noticing. So that's, and what you should be doing, or what your contractor should be doing, is engaging with us, and we have all these tools at our disposal to be able to help you. So not a week goes by where I don't get a complaint that comes in from a legislative office or directly whatever, and I look into every single complaint that comes in on this stuff. Not a week goes by where we don't get a complaint where someone says, where's my permit? You guys have had it for 3 months, and we don't even have an application, right? So if you are hearing something different than what I just said to you about what our priorities are and how we're doing things, you should be reaching out to us. We will, by no means am I trying to say that we're perfect or that we're incapable of making a mistake, but we are acting, and our staff are doing a great job, and we are going to do the very best that we can to make sure that you have a pathway to protect your home. So that was not even close to on track.
That's all right.
Question,
that was good, and we appreciate you bringing those folks to here answer questions specifically, you know, as the night progresses. So,
Yeah. So,
go ahead, Jason. Yeah.
Kind of build on Jared's answer here, and I think he's going to like my answer from a litigation standpoint. When you're talking about timelines for permit approval, as long as the government agency has a reasonable and legitimate concern, which most of the time they do when they're approving these permits, if it takes them, if there's a normal delay for the permit approval or something you would consider abnormally long, and you do lose a house or a structure before that permit's approved, and I'm not going to give you a definitive answer here, but it's highly unlikely that you would be able to win a lawsuit against the government, a condemnation action, where you would consider it a taking of property and you would want to get compensated for whatever the structure is you lost. There's a case from the Michigan Court of Appeals from back in 2005 that was against DEQ. And that's basically the court said that if we allowed people to sue the government every time there was a delay in permit that somehow hurt your property, it would just grind the whole process to a halt. It'd be cost prohibitive, and it might force them to make haphazard decisions because they're thinking about, oh, this property owner is going to sue me if I don't get this approved properly or quickly, and they don't do it properly. So I would assume Jared would like that answer.
Oh, good.
I like not being sued. The last part of that question, if protection is installed without a permit, what are the consequences? Just to be honest with you, I mean, we're not in enforcement mode right now. We've not fined someone since this process started. I'm not promising we're going to get out of that, but our focus even in that, get out of the entire thing without doing that, but our focus on that would be on some of the questionable things that might be happening with contracting along the lake shore. So there are some wonderful contractors out there that are doing great work, but our focus is certainly not going to be based on homeowners. Secondly, frankly, probably the biggest risk that you would run if you, again, I mentioned at times we'll do discretion and we'll find that pathway, but probably the biggest risk that you run in terms of if you install something, we don't hear anything from you, we don't hear anything from your contract, we don't have a permit application, biggest risk you run is that the structure that goes in is not permittable. If your contractor is willing to do that and doesn't want to talk to us and doesn't want to work with us, you might want to ask them why, right? Again, I've outlined that we're going to have a pathway for you. Our intent is not to be running around and finding people. It's counterproductive at this point. We need to be working with you to find solutions. If you put something in that's not permittable, and again, there probably is a lot of that out there right now, and we're focused on getting permits out right now, but at some point we're going to have to deal with those things. The biggest risk would not be fines or anything like that. The biggest risk would be that you're going to have to pay to move it or adjust it later on because it's going to have an impact on your neighbor or because it's going to impact littoral flow or whatever the case may be. So again, I really want to emphasize the intent is that we're going to work with you or work with your contractor to find that pathway. So, and we think that's the most important role for us right now. So,
A lot of questions coming around jetties. To shift gears a little bit, but there's a whole bunch of questions about jetties. So, are jetties allowed off the shoreline in Lake Michigan? And if not, why not? Who would like to take that one? Jared, you didn't get a break.
That's the Jared section. We typically don't say outwardly, no, it's not possible. It's never going to happen, right? But the way that these permitting processes work is you're measuring impacts against one another. And frankly, the least impactful structure and most effective in terms of shoreline erosion is doing armoring right at the bluff toe, typically riprap that needs to be maintained over time. The challenge with jetties and groins and other structures that stick out into the lake is that they interfere with that littoral drift that Greg was mentioning. So essentially, when you put one of those in, not only is it not as effective against erosion as putting rock up against the bluff, but you're also stealing sand from your neighbor that is also protecting their shoreline. And so we don't see that over in West Michigan very much, but if you go to other parts of the state, you can see there are groins lined up one after another on every property from back when it used to be easy to get that kind of a permit. And there's a reason why that happens, because the updrift person gets a beach and the downdrift person gets no beach and gets shoreline erosion. So then they put in one and then they put in one. And so there isn't really, so we certainly don't say no, but in areas where they aren't, we think that there's a better solution than that, frankly.
Did you want to chime in, Greg? No? Good. There's a few specific questions, and I think with some details, I think these are probably better suited for which regard to should I move my home back or should I tear it down? And I think we'll leave that because there's obviously going to be situations that are going to help dictate that decision. But the next one is, if your home does fall into Lake Michigan, or deck or debris, is there a fine for that? Or is there potential risk that you have to pay? And the cleanup, I think, as we move forward, if there is cleanup required, who pays for that? Poor Jared.
It's all right, my section's going to be over soon. So certainly, certainly if debris comes off your property and goes into the lake, whether that's stairs or a home or whatever, technically, legally, that is the landowner's responsibility legally. It's a violation of many statutes, some at the local level, whether it's littering, certainly some at our level, depending on where you are but certain various statutes, and probably at the federal level too. Again, I just mentioned, ultimately, we're not necessarily in enforcement mode. That's not the goal. Fines don't solve any of these problems. So but the backdrop to that is there's already a huge debris problem here and in many places along the Great Lakes because a bunch of stairs have already been lost. So with a specific question about stairs, I think it's unlikely that Eagle would get involved in that. It kind of strikes me as more of a littering type issue. I don't know of any tickets or fines that have been issued for someone losing stairs anywhere in the state. So I think it's pretty safe that that's not going to happen. But I would say that I think if you have the means and the ability to keep, get stairs, if you still have stairs, to get them out of there, if you have the means and the ability, get them out of there before it becomes an even bigger problem. And communities are going to be dealing with this this summer when boating starts. This is going to be a real issue.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that because hopefully you're going to be seeing some messaging come out on a public messaging basis, but Scott and I at the local level definitely have some pretty major concerns with life safety risk when it comes to boaters, especially small watercraft this coming spring and summer season. If you get a chance to look at the size of some of the debris that's out in Lake Michigan right now, you can imagine two people on a Sea-Doo doing 60 miles an hour and all of a sudden come up on one of those chunks of debris. That's a pretty big concern at a local level that we have. So that's something that we're trying to address and figure out. We're not equipped to fish a lot of debris out of Lake Michigan. So it's another one of those weird things from a local level that we are definitely trying to figure out.
I got a phone call 2 weeks ago from a friend whose family has a finger pier from a marina in Chicago washed up on their beach in Sawyer.
Wow.
So you'd be amazed at how far this stuff can move.
Wow. We're almost done with this section here, but last question on that page. Are environmental impacts being considered when discussing solutions? And I think, I'm sorry, Jason, do you want to say something? Pardon me.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Sorry.
Not to keep a mind on litigation here, but playing off of what he said about a possible jet ski or a boater hitting some of your debris in the water, you got to think about that as a homeowner as well. Somebody filing a tort action against you for negligence, and that's not something you want to be dealing with. And chances are it's something with this erosion happening over a period of time. You could be on the hook for something like that because you're cognizant that this is happening and you didn't take measures to deal with it, and now it falls in the water and you don't take measures to clean it up. Someone might have a viable action against you.
Hey, I got a question on that. What about all these trees that are going in every day? You're trying to stop this erosion, but you're not letting people stop it, putting something there. You see what I'm saying? Big trees are going down. I've seen them in the last month. 3 or 4 in one little stretch. And these people ain't even there. They're in Florida or Texas or who knows where. Don't even realize this is going on. But these trees are going to wind up out in the lake.
Well, why don't we hold that question for the end here? We can get some one-on-one unless someone wants to address real quick. Very, very good. Jason, I'll talk to you afterwards. That's a good question.
So, Chris, I just want to
go
stay
ahead.
on this really quick. So the second part, or maybe it was the first part of the question, talked about homes falling in. So That is, so it's frankly, I struggle to answer this question. I probably should have kept my mouth shut, but because there's multiple sides to that, right? So a home falls in, that is a substantial potential to damage the Great Lakes and put a ton of debris out in the Great Lakes. But at the same time, you're dealing with someone who just lost their home. So again, that is legally, that is the homeowner's responsibility. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it is substantially, and Scott may know numbers on this, but it's substantially cheaper to tear that house down when it's at the top of the bluff than to go chasing after it once it goes down into the lake shore. And our expectation in terms of, working with you and not staying away from the penalty enforcement stuff is that there's a good faith effort to deal with that. People all over the lakeshore have different capacities to deal with those things, but our expectation is that there's going to be a good faith effort to try to deal with it. Either tear it down before it goes, or move it if you can, or put shoreline protection in, or if it goes down, we really need to get that out of there because the next storm is going to spread that thing to Chicago, right? So.
The next question involves providers too. Is there a recommended list of providers that would install seawalls to move homes, things that you would recommend based on what the expectations and regulations might be that you would want to see happen? Does that exist? Is it something in the public domain that we can get at, or is it kind of a, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have a list of, and I should have mentioned this before this time, we have a list of contractors we have a dedicated web page for high water issues, got some feedback that it started out small and it's expanded, so we probably need to go back and make sure that it's still clear to everyone. But there's a list of contractors that do house moving, as well as contractors and engineers that do shoreline work. They are not recommended. They're not recommended, but it's not a list of specific ones that we're recommending. That website is michigan.gov/highwater. So highwater, all one word. And then also I want to mention something. One of the efforts that we put forth in October, and I'm going to go back a few questions here, but one of the efforts we put forward in October was to staff up a call center for people who are struggling getting in and out of our permitting process. So, and we staff that up basically during business hours. They're experienced permitters, not shoreline permitters, because we've got those people writing permits, but people who understand our database, our application, and can help you get started. So I'm going to give that phone number out right now, and that is 800-662-9278. And when you call, you'll just tell the operator that you're calling about high water, and they'll get you right to one of our staff. So,
Very good. We'll get that number too. Can we continue on these, and we'll address that individual question as we move forward, okay? Let me just keep going through here if you would. The next question involves zoning and setbacks, and we knew we were going to get to this point at some point. So will shoreline communities need to consider a change in zoning or setback requirements in order to adjust or anticipate erosion events? And then who's making those decisions? Is it the local, et cetera? And what kind of variances may be needed, and who will make those types of decisions?
So this is an interesting one because there's a lot of communities that don't have historic setbacks, and I'm from St. Joseph down the way, and if you look at the North Shore of St. Joe, I would point out that just because you can get something permitted doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. We have, I think there's a real common sense approach when you're building on the shoreline is to take a good look at your neighbors, look around. So if you look at the north side of the pier in St. Joe, it's called Tiscornia Beach, and you'll see this long row of houses that are about 150 yards back, and they've all been there about 90 years. That's a pretty good sign that that's a safe place to build a house. And then we occasionally have somebody who wants to build a house right out on the water, and I can imagine the conversation, honey, this is going to be great. Those guys didn't know what they were doing, putting their house way back up there, and they get the house permitted, and then all of a sudden the water comes up, and now the water's literally in their living room, and they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to move their house back. So the city of St. Joe took that into consideration and came up with a new shoreline ordinance that we helped write with some partners. And a lot of communities are looking at these. They're being established mostly, hopefully, through an engineering process that helps to establish what's a common sense line in the sand, if you will, that says most people behind this line are going to be safe, and it's minimizing impacts. The purpose of having the zoning is not, yes, it's to protect you, but it's also to protect your neighbors. Because every time you put something in front of your home, it's going to affect the neighbor. So when you set a line there, that helps you protect everybody. So a lot of communities are starting to look at that. If you want to Google that, it's called the St. Joseph Shoreline Study. You can find it online. We've worked with a lot of communities. Actually, in Long Beach, Indiana, has a very restrictive set of requirements that we would not recommend any other community. It's very restrictive, and they find themselves with a lot of people asking for variances all the time. The variance process is going to be your normal process through your planning and zoning commissions, and hopefully you can avoid that.
Good. So now we're talking a little bit about inland effects and folks that are on those inland waterways, et cetera. And there's a lot of discussion, and we've received a couple of questions just this evening about no wakes on some of these smaller lakes connected to Lake Michigan. And there's talk about instituting no wake zones in like Lake Macatawa, for example. So the question, where does that coming from? Who's making those decisions? And is it true that we're probably going to see some no wake designations internally that we haven't seen before?
So I know that we have in the House, the State House, legislation or bills up that will look at how do you set wave limit or speed limits so that you don't create waves for your neighbors. And it would be on a temporary basis so that municipalities, local municipalities could make that determination, I believe, with the Department of Natural Resources.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Good, okay. So we're moving on here, and we're talking again, where is the line between public and private responsibility? We're going to get into this whole funding. I know there's a lot of conversation about funding, and that's where we're headed right now, but there's that line between who's responsible. Is this a public issue, or is this a private issue? So where does that line stand? We're down to number 43, when allocating public funding or any funding whatsoever. Nobody wants to grab that one? Oh, Scott, did you want to grab it? Okay. Nick?
Yes, I'm being pushed the mic over. I don't know what that is all about, but so when we're looking at, and I'm going to get a little bit deeper into this probably in a little while when we start talking about disaster funding and how that all works and whatnot, but when we're looking at programs, I want to make this very clear. Right now, as we stand here today, there are 0 federal programs and 0 state programs that address shoreline erosion through the disaster declaration process. I've had to say that numerous times over the last couple months because there is a misunderstanding that through the declaration process there's this big availability of funding that we can gain at this current time. That is not the case. The way the disaster and the declaration process works currently is we need to have a definite start date, we need to have a definite end date, we have to do a damage assessment within 72 hours, and everything operates off of a timeline from the governor to the federal government. So it is really a system that is designed and set up for tornadoes and floods and events where you can put all that criteria in. It's not meant for multiple year long-term erosion events like what we're dealing with now. So that's not to say that we couldn't at some point have a single weather event that creates a catastrophic situation here within the county that we would then go through and use the declaration process at that point. It's just as long-term erosion goes on, we can't use that process. So when you're looking at public and private funding, the public funding that we have through those sources really is in 2 channels. You have your individual assistance for private property owners and your public assistance, which is to reimburse governments for critical infrastructure and other damages that have occurred on the public side. So when we're looking at the individual assistance side, even if you qualified for every single program within that individual assistance within a federal disaster declaration, the max amount you would ever be able to qualify for is around $35,000. So it's not a lot. It's what it's meant to do is put you back up on your feet, get you into a vehicle to the job, back and forth, find you temporary housing. It is definitely not to make everyone whole again. So don't plan on that process as you go through there. So public and private damages are counted differently. They're funded differently through that disaster declaration declaration mechanism. And that's basically how we have the difference between private and public funding for disaster response. So hopefully that answers that question.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yep, so I just wanted to quick jump in and mention, whenever it came out a couple weeks ago, the governor's proposed budget had $40 million for local units of government. I think 10 million of that was for planning, and then $30 million for impacts. They would be done through grants, but again, that's public funding through its climate resiliency, obviously that part of that being high water. So there is at least a proposal out there for some public dollars, but that wouldn't apply to private at this time.
Shifting gears then to insurance, and maybe Jason, you can help us with some of this, or again, feel free to chime in, but is there insurance available for homeowner from an erosion standpoint?
The short answer to that is no. It's not like flood insurance. There actually used to be, for individual property owners, you could go to FEMA for help in the past, but they had an amendment years ago that got rid of that. So erosion's not covered anymore from an individual seeking help basis. Now, as far as the insurance goes, just about every contract that you're going to have as a homeowner is going to have a provision in there that erosion isn't covered. And the reason for that is because it's something that happens gradually over time most of the time. And as far as flooding goes, that's something that the term flooding is defined by the federal government when you're talking about flood insurance. And that's more of something that's sort of a catastrophic event that happens quickly. It's not something that's gradual over time. So, I hate to give you that answer, but even if you were to get flood insurance, which isn't likely because you'd have to be defined within that federal government term, it likely wouldn't cover erosion anyway, even if you did have flood insurance.
That kind of answers the next question. So if erosion was to lead to flooding, unfortunately, that's not criteria for flood insurance to kick in.
Correct. I think that's a pretty safe assessment that even if you try and go that route, you're not going to get there because the flooding was due to the erosion. It wasn't, some catastrophic weather event that happened quickly.
Thank you. Moving on to the economic impact now, as we talk a little bit from a local standpoint, and John's been quiet. You've been lucky so far, John. But we're going to get into that portion of the program here. So what has been the economic impact? Is anyone measuring it in terms of what's happening here in West Michigan due to the erosion issue? Does anyone want to? John, we can talk a little bit about valuations. We can lead into that if that helps.
I have done, as far as the overall economic impact, I'm not sure that's something that's been able to be quantified at this point. But I will say that it does seem that the real estate industry is still alive and well along the lakeshore. The sales activity. I did a little study and looked at sales in the past 12 months from Ludington down to the state line, and there were actually 105 sales on Lake Michigan within the last 12 months. There's 114 active listings at this point, so there's probably a good year's supply of homes out there, which is probably an oversupply if you look at the supply-demand ratio. What's interesting, I thought, and then I took the 105 sales and I went back 5 years to see see if any of them had sold previously during that 5-year period. 9 of them actually had. 4 of that 105 sold for more than they had in the 5-year period before, and 5 of them sold for less than they had in the 5-year period before. So with the data that's available right now, it's very difficult to say on a basis whether or not there's significant impact to property values. However, it really is a site-by-site, site-specific type of a question.
I'll chime in on that too. Overall, as I mentioned earlier, we have a huge group of our agents that are working in that waterfront luxury space, and we see it as a very healthy market. The real estate market, all the way from the Mackinac Straits all the way down through South Haven to the state border, is very healthy. In fact, for our organization, both in the amount of units sold and the sales volume of those homes and the average price are all significantly up, double digits over 2018 and 2019. So we've experienced some really good growth and feel that the market overall is pretty healthy. There are some instances where there's some specific challenges, but overall, very optimistic, even though we're still struggling with a lot of these challenges. So we're echoing that. Good. Next question, maybe John again, and maybe some of our local leaders here, but is it reasonable to expect that tax assessments should be lowered to reflect the problem? And our assessments being lowered as a result. And I noticed Scott just handed the microphone down to Nick very quickly there. So, so I don't know if that means, Nick, you want to take that question, but.
I'm an open book, so Scott knows that. I can just tell you from what I've heard from a lot of our local residents is obviously they appear to want to see that process come into play. I don't know. You know, it's kind of funny. I was talking to John before this in the back room there, and I actually had asked FEMA if they had a specific measurement of square footage of beachfront or sand that they could attribute a dollar figure to. And they don't. There's not a dollar figure that we can use to calculate that. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that process rolls out. And once again, this is not over. It's you know, the erosion's probably going to continue here for another year or so. It'll be interesting to see what happens a year from now.
Sure.
One thing I would like to point out that there's just not enough data at this point to make any firm determination one way or another. Yes, obviously there's some value diminution in some of the properties. There's no question about it. But in talking to some of the assessors along the lakeshore, one of them did point out that there's also a difference between the assessed value and the taxable value. If you've owned your property for quite some time, you're paying taxes on the taxable value, not the assessed value. Now, if you just bought your home within the last couple of years, those should be pretty close. But if you've been in that house for 10, 20, 30 years, your taxable value is considerably less than what the assessed value is. And so even if you were to go in and appeal your taxes and maybe lower that assessed value, your taxable value is more than likely still going to be below and that's what your tax is based on, is that taxable value.
Representative Slaw?
So I know that we have also in the House a bill that's come through to say, even if we can't change the assessment on the property or aren't looking to do that at this point in time, assessments on seawalls or the other stuff we're adding to the property should not be something that creates your assessed value to go up. So I know that that's a bill out there looking to try and maintain that for our constituents. And I guess just let me pair it off of that into, you know, besides that assessment thing, there's 4 other bills that have been written related to high water, erosion, those kinds of things that have come out of either the Senate or the House since October. And of those 5 different bills, 4 of them come out of Ottawa County, either the state senator or the state reps that come from our area. And it just shows, I think, that Ottawa County is looking for how do we move forward, how do we make things happen for the people that live here.
Great. The next question, and maybe we've kind of touched on that a moment ago, but if you do feel that you want to challenge that SCV and you're going to go to the board of review or follow those types of avenues, is there evidence or criteria in order to prove or justify that tax relief because of erosion? Is there any criteria been set, or right now are we still where we traditionally or normally have been?
Well, if you're going to appeal your assessment, you really need an appraisal. to go in there. A local appraisal, we do those obviously. There's other appraisers around that will do those for you, but it's a specific appraisal done for tax appeal purposes. So you want a lot of time. I'm on a board review in Cascade Township. Oftentimes, the homeowner will come in with an appraisal that was performed for a bank, lending purposes, mortgage, whatever. Some of the assessors will take that and look at it. Some of them will say, "I'm sorry, that wasn't done specifically for appealing your assessment. We'll take a look at it, but we're not going to put a lot of weight on it." So if you do it, you want to make sure that the appraiser that you do hire is competent in that area, and that the appraiser is going to have to find comparable sales that would support whatever his value determination is.
Good. John, maybe this question could be too, as we get near the end here. You're working with lenders, obviously, with appraisals and things. Has mortgage underwriting changed any guidelines or practices as a result of erosion or water level issues?
Of the ones I've talked to, nobody's made any big determinations yet, no. Although I talked to a gal today with a local lender, and she said that they will probably, if it's on Lake Michigan or an inland lake that's impacted by the high water, they're probably going to start wanting to know how far back the improvements are from the waterfront, and what that distance is. Get a statement from the appraiser to that respect, and if it's close or within some limit, probably that the lender is going to come up with, they're going to perhaps have an engineering firm go out and take a look at it and see what the impact is there. But so far, no, they haven't.
So we're near the end. Is there any questions before we conclude here that we haven't addressed, something that maybe each one of you might have wanted to touch on, or something that wasn't addressed before we conclude? Did we miss anything? I know there'll be some individual questions that we'll deal with out in the lobby, but go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I just want to say that one of the hardest parts of this whole erosion crisis here in Ottawa County has been the communication stream from the private property owner all the way up through to really our first responders. And one of the things that we've been very successful with so far is any homes that are nearing falling over the edge or nearing having to be demolished, the disconnection of those utilities and resources from that structure prior. We definitely don't want to send our first responders into a situation where we have live gas hooked up to a home that's close. So if anyone has any concerns with where their property is, please reach out to us in emergency management, and we can definitely get you hooked up with the right agencies that would be your responders to your situation.
Good. Go ahead, Greg.
I'd point out something that hasn't come up tonight is sometimes it's not a private property owner, but it's a homeowners association. And that's a bit more of a complication, and one of the challenges is, some of the homes might be right on the water, some of the homes might be backlots. We are working with a lot of homeowners associations who are trying to deal with this, and the advantage they have is they're working with a longer piece of shoreline. So it's like working with a bunch of neighbors, and that's great. I would encourage the homeowner associations to follow a really good process, because we're now getting calls from backlot owners who are suing their homeowners association board because they didn't go through a process that's defendable. So I think that would be something that should be considered.
That's a great point. Very good. Well, I think that'll wrap. We have a couple thank yous real quick. I want to appreciate all the special guests. Thank you for joining us. The Holland Civic Center has been amazing to set up for tonight's venue, and the team at Coldwell Banker, the agents, and the staff to put on this tonight. And of course, our panelists, we really appreciate that, and we thank you for joining us tonight. Big round of applause. Please feel free to reach us at the end. We have rack cards with information. We'll make our way to the back there, and if we'll deal with individual questions. Enjoy the night, safe driving, and thanks again.